Well, welcome back, everybody. We are now in the episode 3 of our Lenten study, and today we have a very familiar mountain to climb. It won't be nearly as difficult as the very emotional mountain that we climbed last week. As always, we'll have a discussion live and on the Zoom Wednesday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. Join us if you can. And as you can see today, we're going to be looking at the second of 2 of our Old Testament texts throughout our Scaling the Seven Summits series. So as I read this text from Exodus chapter 20, you'll find it very familiar. It's the story of the 10 Commandments. And some of the text I'm leaving in this kind of tannish color like you see here. And some of the text you'll see in a white font. And the difference is I'm leaving the preface and the commands and a little bit of the after story in the normal font. But what you see in the white font is what our Book of Confessions calls things that are annexed to the law. And that's going to be one of the things that we look at this morning. So I'll circle back in a little bit to both the Book of Confessions and these annexations. But for now, let's read the text. It's kind of long. Then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents, to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. For 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God, and you shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. Honor your father and your mother, so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or male or female slave, or ox, or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. When all the people witnessed the thunder and lightning, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking, they were afraid and trembled and stood at a distance and said to Moses, You speak to us, and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, or we will die. Moses said to the people, Do not be afraid, for God has come only to test you and to put the fear of him upon you, so that you do not sin. Then the people stood at a distance, while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. This ends the reading. All right. So it's an interesting chapter when we read the whole thing together. And so we're going to study 5 quick topics today. And because there are so many commands, we're not going to be able to go into detail about them. But I want to give you some general tools for how to think about them. And, of course, we can always pick up on discussions on Wednesday. One thing we're not going to address to much extent in the video, but what we will talk about on Wednesday is the question about whether we should speak about the 10 Commandments as a standalone text that has a kind of primacy over other texts or not. I think the responses to that question are much more interesting than we've been taught to think. So that's something that for sure we'll discuss on Wednesday. But here are our topics today. We're going to do a quick review of the Ten Commandments. And you notice that the last 5 commandments were set off with the words, you shall not, or if you grew up with the King James Bible, thou shalt not, right? So we're also going to look at the corresponding you shall that go with that, and I'll tell you why we're going to do that. We're going to look at the ramifications, the explanations. These are the annexations that I had in the white text as we were reading along, and look at some of the implications there. We're going to look at the context in which the story lies, particularly as an unfolding story of the Exodus. On Wednesday, we'll give a little more attention to the context of when the story was written and where that goes in Israel's history. And then we're going to look at some intertext, particularly how are the Ten Commandments revisited elsewhere in the Scriptures and in the New Testament in particular. I think we're going to find some interesting things. We're going to briefly touch on that in this video and talk more about that on Wednesday. Okay? So these are the topics. We'll take them all in order. Let's do a quick review of the Ten Commandments. So first of all, it begins with what some of our confessions, like the Westminster Catechism and others, in the Book of Confessions of the Presbyterian Church, called the preface. Now let me just tell you, the Book of Confessions is a collection of historic statements of faith throughout the history of the church. It starts with early church confessions like the Nicene Creed and then the Apostles' Creed. It has 7 different confessions and documents from the Reformation era. We're going to make reference to the Heidelberg Catechism, as well as the Westminster Larger Catechism. And then it has several 20th century documents as well. So it's a collection of statements of faith, each of which is like a snapshot in the moving story of church history. And we use these confessions not as infallible laws, but as faithful guides on how we interpret Scripture. And I think they're very helpful today, particularly as we look at these 10 commands. And like in the Heidelberg Catechism, when they break down the 10 commandments, the first part that says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, is listed as part of the first command, you shall have no other gods before me. But in the Westminster Catechism, it's listed as the preface that kind of sets off the rest of the commands. And I think that's a very helpful way of thinking about it. So the preface says, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And what that means, I think, is that what follows is a liberative text. It's part of a liberation story. And it's part of that story of how you go from having a slave mentality in Egypt. So the people of Israel were in Egypt for 400 years. So all the ones who are alive at this point have only known that sojourn as slaves and as second, third, fourth, fifth generation slaves. And there's a certain slavish mentality that one has when raised in that. You long for freedom, but you don't always know exactly what to do with freedom. And particularly when your freedom, your liberation, is dependent on a loving, compassionate God as opposed to a harsh taskmaster. So the story of the Exodus is the story of the people of Israel moving from slavery and the slave mentality into the promised land and land of freedom, a freedom mentality with a loving God. That's very important. So you might remember a couple of summers ago here at St. Mark, we did a series on the 10 Commands calling them 10 liberative words, right? 10 words of life. And the preface gives us a reason for doing that. So don't just glide past that as kind of, the uninteresting part. I think it sets off everything else into a particular mode of thought. So you have the preface, and then the first 4, the Heidelberg Catechism says that the first 4 commandments teach us how we ought to live in relation to God, And so we could say that the first four are more or less religious commands, if you're okay with that term. If not, grab your own. And so those first four, teaching us how to live in relation with God, is number one, you'll have no other gods before me. Number two, you will not make for yourself an idol. Number three, you won't have a wrongful use of the Lord's name. And then number four is to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. So those are the practices of a holy people of God. And those are the first four. We'll call those religious, and then we'll call the last six, more or less, the ethical commands. And these are the ones that we're probably a little more familiar with. Honor your parents, you shall not murder, commit adultery, you shall not steal, shall not bear false witness. And the last one says, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, your neighbor's wife, your male or female slave, their ox, their donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's, which that last phrase made the whole list a little bit redundant. But it speaks, importantly, not to an act, but to a disposition. We've already said don't steal, so you can't steal your neighbor's donkey. But now you don't even covet your neighbor's donkey. And so it leans into not just the actions, but the affections that we have. So that's rather important, I think. So those are the 10, right? You've got the preface, which sets it into a context of liberative words. You've got the kind of religious aspect of how we live before God and God before us, and then how we live toward one another. Now, the last six, the last five, rather, begin with the phrase, you shall not. You shall not. And again, I want to mention one of the confessions in our book of confessions, this time particularly the Westminster Larger Catechism. And question 99 asks, what's forbidden? What's required? What's in the 10 Commands? And as part of the answer, it says, where a duty is commanded. So, for example, like, remember the Sabbath day. That's a command to a duty. And keep it holy, right? Where a duty is commanded, then the contrary sin is forbidden. So the fourth command doesn't go into a lot of detail about what you can't do on the Sabbath, but by saying remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, then one can conjecture that corresponding to that positive statement is some negative statements, what you shall not do. Likewise, if you have a command that says you shall not do this, then you can imagine that there are also duties that are required that correspond with the sins that are forbidden. So the Westminster Larger Catechism spends a lot of time just kind of breaking down each of the commands, talking about the duties that are required there as well as the sins that are forbidden there. And the catechism set up in the form of questions and answers. So let me draw your attention, for example, to the 8th command. So question 140 in the Westminster Larger Catechism from the Book of Confessions asks the question, what is the 8th command? And the answer is, the 8th commandment is, thou shalt not steal. So the next question is, what are the duties required? So even though the command itself is set in the language of what's forbidden, they always start with what are the duties that are required. And listen to this. So you shall not steal is what we've always heard. So now what they're offering to us is that within that one prohibition, there are all these duties that we should be striving toward. The duties required in the 8th command are truth, faithfulness, and justice in contracts and commerce between man and man, rendering to everyone his due, restitution of goods unlawfully detained from the right owners thereof, giving and lending freely according to our abilities and the necessities of others, moderation of our judgments, wills, and affections concerning worldly goods, and a provident care and study to get keep, use, and dispose of those things which are necessary and convenient for the sustentation of our nature and suitable for our condition. There's more. What's required from the eighth command? A lawful calling. This is our job. And a diligence in it. Frugality. Avoiding unnecessary lawsuits and suretyship and other like engagements. And an endeavor by all, just and lawful means to procure, preserve, and further the wealth and outward estate of others as well as our own. That's a mouthful, right? You started with do not steal, and suddenly you've got all these things that are tied up in that. So the next question, 142, asks, well, what sins are forbidden in the eighth command? And you're like, well, stealing, right? But there's more to it. That's a little more sophisticated. The sins forbidden in the eighth command, besides neglecting the duties that we just named in question 141, are theft, robbery, man-stealing, and receiving anything that is stolen, fraudulent dealing, false weights and measures, removing landmarks, injustice and unfaithfulness in contracts between man and man, or in matters of trust, oppression, extortion, usury, bribery, vexatious lawsuits, unjust enclosures and depopulation. That's redlining, folks. Engrossing commodities to enhance the price. Unlawful callings and other unjust and sinful ways of taking or withholding from our neighbor what belongs to them, or enriching ourselves. Covetousness, inordinate prizing and affecting worldly goods, distrustful, distracting cares and studies and getting, keeping, and using them, envying at the prosperity of others, and likewise idleness, prodigality, wasteful gaming, and all other ways whereby we do unduly prejudice our own outward estate, and defrauding others of the due use and comfort of the estate which God has given them. Now, that's two big paragraphs on this statement right here. So you can imagine that one of the gifts of the Westminster folk is that they have a tendency to go on and on and on about things, right? And that's why very few of us cuddle up to the Book of Confessions, and snuggle up with it at night and read it for pleasure. But I want to say this, as wordy as that is, there's this tremendous insight here that the command not to steal is not just a personal command about your or my actions in a given moment of whether we ought to take some candy from the store or steal some, embezzle some money to which we have access and so forth. It actually very sophisticatedly says you can't follow this law as long as you don't look at it systemically. And you can't have false weights and measures and carry out business without violating this law. You can't defraud people. Defraud becomes even as popular of a word as stealing when it comes to interpreting this text. So I really want to applaud the Westminster divines, as they're called, who have taken the time to think through all the ramifications of the systemic institution of a phrase, do not steal. So, for example, if you have somebody who's incredibly poor because of the job market and the housing market and things perhaps beyond their control, and they devolve into stealing a loaf of bread in order to feed their children or themselves or something like that, we think, well, do not steal. And for years we've thought the harsh command here says, well, we chop off their hand or we throw them in jail or put them in poor people's prison or debtor's prison or something like that. When in fact, what the Westminster folk are telling us is, why do you have a system where somebody can't afford to eat? Why do you have a system where someone has no means of income? You can't do that. You can't have a business practice like that. You are to look out for the estate of your neighbor, not simply protect your own assets, with this law. I think it's a tremendous approach. And frankly, I think that list of what's forbidden by this commandment is an outright criticism of conspicuous capitalism and consumerism. So I think we ought to take that Book of Confessions and that approach a little more seriously. So we ask, when we look at these commands, what's required? We ask, what is forbidden? And we think about it not just personally, but systemically, because these laws were given to a people as they were learning how to live as free people of God in community with one another. Okay, so let's look at the ramifications, the explanations. These are the annexations that I had in the white text earlier. So in the Westminster Larger Catechism, again, it asks, what are special things are we to consider in the Ten Commandments? This is question 100. And it says we're to consider the preface, which we talked about, the substances of the commands themselves, which we just talked about, and finally, the several reasons annexed to some of them to enforce them, okay? So commands number 2, 3, and 4, maybe 3, 4, and 5, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5, I can't remember exactly. They have an annexation connected to them. And let me just give you one example. The second command, which is the commandment not to have idols, right? The annexation, the added part, which I had in the white text as we read it, said, "For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of their parents, to the third and fourth generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments." Okay, so that certainly gives this command not to make any idols some heft, right? That violating this is going to have ramifications for generations to come. But that annexation that's added to it, that's actually a very contentious bit of theology. It is picked up and argued throughout the Old Testament, and not all of the Old Testament writers, or New Testament writers for that matter, agree on whether that's true or not. Is it true that God visits the sins of the parents onto their children to the third and fourth generation? Most people accept for sure that God visits grace to the 1,000th generation, but are children responsible for the sins of their parents? And there are places in the Bible where the answer is, well, of course. And you see that played out all the time. If you have abusive parents, you're going to have children who really have to deal with that for a long time. So just in the matter of life, not God executing this in any way, but just in the matter of life, children bear the sins of their parents. But on the other hand, we are free and transformable individuals who can overcome those things, to some degree or another. And so we're not locked in to being the product of what our parents raised us to be. And so that question, whether the sins of the parents are visited onto the children, sometimes gets a yes and sometimes gets a no in Scripture. You've heard me talk about it before with reference to the proverb, "The parents have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge." That's a proverb that was created somewhere outside of the Bible and is referred to several times in the Scriptures. And frankly, the prophet Ezekiel says, stop saying that the parents have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. Everybody pays for their own sins. So Ezekiel would look at this annexation to the second command and say, no, I don't think so. That's not how I see God. That's not how God operates. Which is interesting, because what it gives us is that when these commands are written, this was the kind of dominant theological view of how God works throughout the generations. But when Ezekiel's writing, he had a very different view. And often those views are in contention with each other in the Scriptures, not just simply stated one place as true for all time and all places. So I think the annexations, if nothing else, give us an insight to the theology of the writing community, and give us an insight into some of the arguments and presentations they're trying to make about that theology. So we can talk about that more on Wednesday if you wish. The next topic is to think about the context, right? So the narrative context of the Ten Commandments is that it takes place as part of this journey from slavery in Egypt to freedom in the Promised Land. And the second context, which we'll look at a little more closely on Wednesday, is, I think I mentioned it earlier, the context in the life of Israel as these texts were written and what's going on in the life of Israel at that time, because that helps us to see why the texts were shaped the way that they were. And I should tell you that in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 5, you're going to find a representation of these 10 commands. So you can do a little side-by-side comparison. They're very, very much alike, slight differences. The book of Deuteronomy, the title, Deuteronomy, is made up of two Greek words, deutero, which means second, and nomos, which means law. So the title of that book means the law, the reiterated law, something like that. And that's why we have a representation of the Ten Commandments there in Deuteronomy chapter 5. And finally, in the narrative context, you heard me read after we got through the Ten Commandments all about this scary mountain and the thunder and the lightning and the people being afraid, and said to Moses, "You talk to us. We can't look at God. We'll die." If you want to see a little bit more of what that's about, then I'm going to invite you to back up a little bit and read Exodus chapter 19 before you read chapter 20. And you'll read a little bit more about it. We can talk about this more on Wednesday, but more or less I want to give you this image in your head, that the holy God of glory in the scriptures is the loving God, like a parent, like a mother, like a father, if you're thinking of a good mother and good father, whose faithfulness lasts for generations, whose steadfast love is forever. But the holy God of glory is not something with which we can trifle. And I like to think of it as God as something like a nuclear fuel rod in their minds. You know, in that nuclear fuel rod, you have a tremendous amount of power and energy all built up in there. And you can approach that power and energy, and you can rely on that power and energy. But you don't do so stupidly, right? You've probably seen people who mess with nuclear fuel rods are in like triple-lated hazmat suits with large tongs, and they'll pick up that rod and very carefully move it from one thing to another. And of course, we can't dispose of them because eventually that's going to kill us all. And there's just so much power there. And in some respects, when you hear the word glory or God's holiness, I think what they're trying to point us to is that this is the God of energy. Whether you think of God as you know, in personal terms, or just as the source and ground of life and being, this is a God of tremendous power and energy. But you don't trifle with God. You don't pick up a nuclear fuel rod in your bare hand and stick it in your pocket like Homer Simpson and live to tell about it. Because there's radiating power and glory here. And in some respects, that's how I want you to see this scary mountain on which the Ten Commands are given. And finally, the last topic, again, is something we're going to pick up more on Wednesday. We're going to talk about intertext. We're going to look at New Testament expressions of the Ten Commandments. They'll surprise us a little bit. And we'll save them for Wednesday, except for this one. First of all, in Matthew chapter 22, someone asked Jesus, "What is the greatest command?" You're aware of this conversation. And when Jesus answers that question, like if someone had never read the New Testament and they heard Christian Sunday school lessons on the Ten Commandments, If someone asks, what's the greatest command? They'd probably say something like, don't murder, or don't have any other gods before God. Try to just decide which one really names them all. Jesus answers this question without referring to Deuteronomy chapter 5 or Exodus chapter 20. Instead, he answers from Deuteronomy chapter 6. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul. And then he adds a second half from Leviticus chapter 19, and you will love your neighbor as yourself. Maybe that's chapter 18. Sorry. And you will love your neighbor as yourself. And notice what Jesus says. On these two commandments hang all the law and prophets. So if you really want to reduce them down to something, just love God with all you got and love your neighbor like you love yourself, according to Jesus. That's one of the expressions in the New Testament. I would also say that this weekend in worship, at least the way I've written the worship bulletin so far, it's still under construction, we're going to look at Paul's letter to the church in Galatia, where he talks about the fruit of the Spirit as being another kind of expression of what the Ten Commandments are trying to say. So that's all we have time for today. I hope to see you on Wednesday. As you know, I've left a lot of things on the table for us to address at that time, so we'll make the most of that time. Thanks again.